I never imagined that Father's Day, of all days, would be the moment my marriage came crumbling down. It was supposed to be a celebration, a day where I felt appreciated, honored. Instead, it became the day I realized I had been nothing more than a prop in my wife's carefully curated life. It started with the party. My wife, Claire, had insisted on throwing a grand gathering at our house. A surprise, she had called it, her smile too wide, her voice too sweet. I should have sensed the trap. The guests arrived, her family, her friends, a few of my colleagues. I had expected a warm afternoon, some heartfelt words, maybe a homemade card from our son, Ethan. But what I got was something entirely different. Claire stood in the center of the room, a glass of wine in hand, her voice ringing out like a bell. "Let's all raise a glass," she announced, her eyes twinkling with something I couldn't quite place. "To my dear husband James, the most mediocre father of all time." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, uncertain, hesitant. My chest tightened. "Claire," I said, forcing a smile, "what are you doing?" She grinned as if I were being ridiculous. "Oh, come on, just a little fun. We all know you try, James. But let's be honest, between your long work hours, your so-called dad jokes, and your inability to remember a single school event, well, you're not exactly winning any Father of the Year awards." Laughter. This time stronger. I felt the heat rise to my face. "Claire, that's enough." But she wasn't done. She turned to Ethan, our 6-year-old son, and in a syrupy voice asked, "Sweetheart, tell everyone, what did Daddy forget this week?" Ethan looked at me, shifting uncomfortably. He didn't want to answer. Claire nudged him playfully. "Come on, tell them. It's just for laughs." I wanted to grab Ethan and walk out, but I was frozen. I had spent years swallowing Claire's subtle jabs, her passive-aggressive remarks disguised as jokes. But this? Humiliating me in front of our friends, my own son? This was something else entirely. Then Ethan mumbled, "He forgot my art show." The room erupted in laughter. Something inside me broke. I locked eyes with my wife. For a second, her smile faltered. She could see it. Something had changed. I set my drink down and stood up. The room grew silent. "You know what's funny, Claire?" My voice was steady, colder than I intended. "That I've spent years working to provide for this family. That I've sacrificed sleep, hobbies, even friendships to make sure you and Ethan had everything you needed. That I stayed up late helping with his homework, even after 12-hour shifts. But the funniest part?" I let out a dry laugh. "The funniest part is that I thought I was married to someone who actually respected me." Claire's face drained of color. "James, it was just a joke." "A joke," I repeated, nodding. "Yeah, I get it now." I turned to Ethan, kneeling so I could look him in the eye. "Hey, buddy," I said softly. "I'm sorry I missed your art show. I should have been there. That's on me, and I promise you, from now on, I won't let anything keep me from showing up for you." Ethan nodded, his little arms wrapping around me. I stood up, looked around at the guests, many now shifting uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. Then, without another word, I walked out. And as I did, I knew one thing for certain. This was the last Father's Day I would ever spend as Claire's husband. I didn't stop walking until I reached my car. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing. Claire had humiliated me before. Small digs, dismissive comments, but nothing like this. This was different. This was calculated. As I sat there trying to calm my breathing, my phone buzzed. "Claire." "James, don't be dramatic. Come back inside." Claire. "Seriously? You're embarrassing yourself." I stared at the messages, my jaw tightening. A few seconds later, another text. "Claire. Fine, go pout. But don't think for a second that you're leaving me." I exhaled slowly. "Not leaving you?" That's when I knew. I had to. The investigation begins. That night, after Ethan was asleep, I sat across from Claire in the kitchen. The air between us was thick, electric. "I'm done," I said. She scoffed, arms folded. "Oh, please, you're not serious." "More serious than I've ever been." Her smirk faltered. "James, don't be ridiculous. You're not going to divorce me over a joke." I leaned forward. "It wasn't a joke, Claire. It was a public execution. And I'm done being the fool in your little show." She opened her mouth, then shut it. For the first time in years, she had no comeback. Then her phone vibrated. Her eyes flickered to the screen just for a second, but I caught it. And in that instant, I saw it. A flicker of guilt. A hunch formed in my mind. "Who was that?" I asked. She hesitated, just for a second. Then, "No one." Liar. I stood up, walked to the bedroom, and closed the door behind me. My heart was pounding. Something wasn't right. I had brushed off Claire's cruelty for years, but now, standing on the edge of leaving her, something told me I needed to look deeper. And so, I did. The secret unveiled. I had never been the paranoid type. But that night, something in me snapped. I knew Claire's passwords. She had never bothered to hide them. Her phone was in the kitchen, so I used her laptop. I opened her messages, and what I found made my blood run cold. A conversation with someone saved as M. M. Did he leave? Claire. Yeah. He stormed out. So predictable. M. Told you. He's weak. He won't go through with it. Claire. He won't. He's too afraid to lose Ethan. And once the divorce is on my terms, he'll be left with nothing. M. I can't wait until this is over. We'll finally be together without sneaking around. Claire. Soon, babe. I just need to make sure I get everything first. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring with rage. She had planned this, not just tea, the public humiliation, not just the insults. She had been setting me up, to look like the bad guy, to make sure she got everything, and she had help. I scrolled up. The messages went back months, dinner plans, weekend meetups, discussions about my assets, my hands curled into fists. I closed the laptop slowly, my mind a storm of fury and disbelief. Claire, my wife, the mother of my child, had been planning this for months. The public humiliation, the messages with M, the way she was so sure I wouldn't leave her. She thought she had me trapped. She thought wrong. I wasn't going to be another clueless fool caught in her web. If she wanted war, she was going to get it, a counterattack. Begins I needed a plan. If I confronted her now, she'd twist it, make excuses, gaslight me into thinking I was overreacting. No, I had to be strategic. I grabbed my phone and dialed. A number I never thought I'd need. Hey, Mark, I need a divorce lawyer, and I need the best. Mark was an old college friend, a high-powered attorney specializing in exactly this kind of situation. If Claire thought she could outmaneuver me, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. Tell me everything, Mark said. And I did. The texts, the setup, the fact that she was waiting for me to file so she could play the victim and walk away, with everything. Mark listened in silence, then let out a low whistle. You're dealing with a shark, James. But lucky for you, I hunt sharks for a living. Gathering the evidence over the next few days, I played the role of the clueless husband. Acted distant but not suspicious. I still slept in our bed. I still smiled for Ethan. I still went to work like nothing had changed, but behind the scenes, I was building my case. I backed up every incriminating message, screenshots, emails, call logs. I stored them on a secure drive and sent copies to Mark. I checked our financial records. Turns out Claire had been siphoning money from our joint account into a secret one. Stupid mistake. I was still legally entitled to half of it. I installed a voice recorder in my home office. If she tried to bait me into a fight, I'd have proof of her manipulation. I hired a private investigator. If M was who I suspected, I needed proof. And I had a damn good idea of where to find it. And then, 3 days later, I got my answer. The PI sent me photos. Claire, at a hotel, with Michael. Michael, my best friend. The final move, it was all I needed. That night, I set the stage. I invited Claire to dinner. Just the two of us. A nice restaurant, candlelit table, everything perfect. She walked in, smug, thinking I was apologizing. I smiled at her. Claire, I just wanted to thank you for being honest with me. She blinked. Honest? I slid my phone across the table. The photos of her and Michael, the texts. The bank transfers. Her face turned white. You played the game well, I said. But you made one mistake. You underestimated me. Her mouth opened, closed. She had nothing to say. I leaned in. The divorce papers are on your desk. You'll find. My terms generous because I could take you for everything. Silence. Then a whisper. James, we can talk about this. I stood, tossed a few bills on the table, smirked. We already did. And just like that, I walked away. I walked out of that restaurant feeling lighter than I had in years. Claire had underestimated me, and now she was left scrambling in the ruins of her own deception. But I wasn't done yet. No, this wasn't just about walking away. This was about making sure she never had the chance to manipulate me or my son again. The fallout begins. By the time I got home, Claire was already there, waiting. Her face was a mask of desperation, a stark contrast to the smug, confident woman who had humiliated me just days ago. James, please, she started, her voice softer now. You're making a mistake. I leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. Enlighten me. She swallowed hard. Michael, he meant nothing. It was stupid. I was angry and save it, I cut in. You weren't just having an affair. You were planning to ruin me. You were trying to steal my son from me. She paled. I wasn't. I pulled out my phone and pressed play. Her voice filled the room. He won't. He's too afraid to lose Ethan. And once the divorce is on my terms, he'll be left with nothing. Her breath hitched. She took a step back like she had been struck. You recorded me? She whispered. I made sure I had proof, I said. Now let's talk about how this is going to end, because you don't have a say in it anymore. Taking back control, Claire was still reeling when I laid out my demands. Full custody of Ethan. She could have visitation rights, but I wasn't about to let my son grow up under the influence of a woman who saw people as tools to manipulate. She walks away from the house. She had been trying to set things up so she'd get everything. I made sure she got nothing. No spousal support. She had siphoned money from our accounts, and I had the evidence to prove it. At first, she resisted. She cried, she yelled, she even tried to guilt-trip me. But then I showed her the legal paperwork my lawyer had drafted, the evidence against her, the fight she would never win. And just like that, the fight left her. She signed. The final blow? I thought that would be the end of it. I thought Claire would slink away, licking her wounds. But then, 2 days later, I got a call from Michael's wife, Sarah. I need to see you, she said. When we met up, she handed me a folder. I hired a private investigator, too, she said, her voice tight. I opened the folder and felt a new wave of disgust rise in me. Turns out, Michael and Claire's affair had been going on for years. They had started long before I even suspected. And the worst part? Claire had been using our money to fund their little escapades. Sarah gave me a tight smile. I figured you'd want to bury them too. And just like that, I had the final piece. Sent everything to Claire's family, to our mutual friends, to Michael's job, where workplace affairs weren't exactly tolerated. By the time the dust settled, Claire had lost everything. Michael's wife took him to the cleaners. He lost his job. Claire had no home, no money, and no one left to manipulate. And me, I had my son, my dignity, and a future free of the woman who had tried to destroy me. Epilogue. A new beginning, a year. Later, on Father's Day, Ethan and I sat on the porch of our home watching the sunset. "Happy Father's Day, Dad," he said, handing me a handmade card. I smiled, ruffling his hair. "Best one yet, buddy." Because this time, it was real. A year had passed since I walked away from Claire, and in that time, my life had changed in ways I never imagined. The divorce had been swift, brutal, and final. Claire tried to fight at first, but once she realized she had no leverage, no money, no house, no sympathy, she crumbled. She signed the papers, packed her bags, and disappeared from my life. Michael? He lost everything. His wife, Sarah, drained him dry in their divorce, and with my little gift to his company exposing his workplace affair, he was swiftly fired. Last I heard, he was bouncing between low-paying jobs trying to scrape by. And me? I was thriving, Life rebuilt, I had gotten full custody of Ethan, and my focus was on being the best father I could be. No more missed events, no more distractions. Just him and me, finally free from Claire's manipulation. But life had a funny way of throwing surprises my way. One evening, I was at Ethan's soccer game when I felt a tap on my shoulder. "James?" I turned and froze. It was Sarah, Michael's ex-wife. I hadn't seen her since we last met to share evidence against our exes. She looked different, lighter, happier. "Sarah," I said, surprised, "didn't expect to see you here." She smiled. "My nephew's on the team." "I didn't expect to see you either, at least not smiling like that," I chuckled. "Turns out life's a lot better when you cut out toxic people," she nodded. "Tell me about it." We stood in silence for a moment, watching the kids run up and down the field. Then she glanced at me. "So, how about we grab a coffee sometime? Maybe compare notes on life after divorce?" I looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something unfamiliar, something I had forgotten existed. Hope. I smiled. I'd like that. And just like that, a new chapter began. Epilogue. The best Father's Day. Yet a year later, on Father's Day, I sat on the porch, watching Ethan run around the yard. Beside me, Sarah laughed as she sipped her coffee, the morning sun warming our faces. Ethan ran up and handed me a homemade card. "Happy Father's Day, Dad." I opened it, grinning at the messy crayon drawing of the two of us with the words, "Best Dad Ever," scrawled across the top. I pulled him into a hug. "Best one yet, buddy," Sarah nudged me. "Told you life after divorce could be good." I chuckled, shaking my head. Life wasn't just good. Life had finally settled into something I could call peaceful. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells, bracing for the next cruel remark, the next mind game. I had my son, a new sense of purpose, and, if I was being honest, a growing connection with Sarah that I hadn't quite been ready to acknowledge until now. But peace never lasts forever. One evening, as I was putting Ethan to bed, my phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. I frowned, but answered. "Hello?" A moment of silence. Then, a voice I hadn't heard in a year. "James." "It's me." Claire. The return of the ghost, I should have hung up. I should have ignored her, blocked the number, and gone back to my life. But against my better judgment, I stayed on the line. "What do you want, Claire?" A shaky breath. "I need to talk to you. Please." I almost laughed. Talk? After everything? Not my problem. I moved to hang up, but her next words froze me in place. "It's about Ethan." A new threat. The next day, I met her at a cafe. She looked different. Thinner, tired, her once perfectly polished exterior now dull and worn. "I don't have much time," I said, crossing my arms. "Say what you need to say." She hesitated, then leaned forward. James, I made a mistake. I scoffed. You made a lot of mistakes. Which one are we talking about? Her eyes flashed with something. Regret? Fear? I wasn't sure. She sighed. I should have never given up custody. But I was angry. I thought I could rebuild my life without you. I was wrong. I stiffened. Claire! She held up a hand. I'm not trying to take him away from you. Pause. But someone else might. My stomach turned. What the hell does that mean? She swallowed hard. Michael is trying to sue for custody. The fight I never saw coming. I laughed. A bitter, humorless sound. Michael? As in the guy you cheated on me with? He has no claim to Ethan. She bit her lip. James, I never told you the full story. When we were together, there was a time when I told Michael that Ethan might be his. My blood turned to ice. You what? I whispered, my voice dangerously low. It wasn't true, she rushed to say. I was angry at you. I wanted him to stay and I said something I shouldn't have. But now he's using it as an excuse to drag you into court. I stood abruptly, my hands clenched into fists. If he wants a fight, he'll get one. She grabbed my wrist. James, listen to me. He knows how to play dirty. He'll make this a nightmare if we don't work together. I yanked my arm away. We are not a team, Claire. You made sure of that. She exhaled shakily. I know, but please, for Ethan's sake, be ready. He's coming for you. I turned and walked out without another word. The battle ahead by the time. I got home, my mind was already racing through strategies. I called Mark, my lawyer, and laid it all out. This is ridiculous, I said. He has zero legal ground. Mark was quiet for a moment. That depends. If he pushes for a paternity test, Ethan is mine. My voice was firm. Mark sighed. Then we fight. And we win. But James, if Michael is desperate enough to try this, he won't fight fair. I gritted. My teeth. Claire had tried to destroy me. I survived. Michael thought he could take my son. He had no idea who he was messing with. If Michael wanted a war, he was about to get one. The moment I left the cafe, I knew I had to act fast. I spent the next few days with my lawyer, Mark, preparing for whatever legal nightmare Michael was about to throw at me. And then it came. Thick envelope, hand-delivered to my doorstep. Petition for paternity test and custody. Review, I clenched my jaw as I read the document. The claim? That Michael had reason to believe Ethan was biologically his and that he was entitled to legal rights as the father. Unbelievable. Ethan was mine, a new kind of battle. I called Mark immediately. He's bluffing, I snapped. Maybe, Mark said, carefully. But legally, this petition forces us to respond. If he convinces the judge that there's doubt about paternity, they could order a DNA test. I nearly crushed my phone in my hand. No judge is that stupid. Mark sighed. You'd be surprised. Family courts don't always operate on logic. Michael is banking on causing enough chaos that you either give up or he gets something out of it. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. What does he want? Money? Some twisted revenge? Mark hesitated. James, you might not like the answer. I exhaled sharply. Spit it out. He doesn't want Ethan, Mark said grimly. He wants to destroy you. A cold rage settled in my chest. The smear campaign begins. It didn't take long before Michael went on the offensive. I started getting calls from mutual friends, people I hadn't heard from in years, asking me if it was true. If what was true? I growled into the phone. That you knew Ethan wasn't yours, and you've been keeping him away from his real father. I nearly threw my phone across the room. Michael was spreading lies. The next day, I got an email from my boss. James, we need to talk. There's some concerning rumors going around about you. I slammed my laptop shut. Michael wasn't just trying to take my son, he was trying to destroy my entire life. The counterattack I met with Mark that night, anger burning through me. "I want to end this now," Mark nodded. "Then we have to do more than defend. We have to attack." So we did. I filed for a harassment order against Michael. He was spreading false information, interfering with my job, and attempting to cause emotional distress. The court wouldn't like that. We launched a full background check. Michael had skeletons. I knew he did. And I was going to find them. We set a trap. I called Claire. "I need your help," I said, my voice cold but firm. She hesitated. "James, you owe me." Silence. Then a quiet, "What do you need?" I explained the plan. Claire would meet with Michael, pretend she was second-guessing the custody decision, and get him to admit, on tape, that this wasn't about Ethan, that it was about revenge. And to my complete surprise, she agreed. The end game 2 nights later. "I got the call." "It worked," Claire whispered. "I got everything." She sent me the recording. Michael's voice was clear as day. "I don't give a damn about the kid. I just want James to lose. He took everything from me, his job, his wife. Now I'll take something from him." I smiled. The next morning, we presented the evidence in court. The judge listened, his expression growing colder by the second. When the recording finished, he turned to Michael. "Mr. Bennett, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Michael stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. The judge sighed. "Petition denied. And Mr. Carter?" He turned to me. "I suggest you file a restraining order. Immediately." The final victory Michael lost, not just in court, but in every way. His reputation was ruined, his legal fees drained him, and now with a restraining order in place, he couldn't come near Ethan, or me, again, for Claire, she disappeared from my life after that. Maybe in her own twisted way, she realized she had gone too far. And me? I had my son, my job, my life. And on the next Father's Day, as I sat in the park with Ethan watching him play, Sarah beside me, with her hand in mine, I realized something. I hadn't just won the battle. I had won my freedom. For the first time in a long time, my life felt like mine again. Michael was out of the picture. Claire had faded into irrelevance. The chaos they had unleashed was behind me, and my world had finally found peace. But if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that peace never lasts forever, and this time the storm came from somewhere I never expected. An unexpected message. It was a quiet Saturday morning. Ethan was watching cartoons, Sarah was in the kitchen making coffee, and I was flipping through emails when my phone buzzed. Unknown. Number. "I need to talk. It's important. It's about Ethan." My stomach tightened. I stared at the screen. I didn't recognize the number, but I had a feeling in my gut, one I couldn't ignore. I texted back. "Me. Who is this?" A few seconds later, my phone rang. I hesitated before answering. "Hello?" A woman's voice came through, low and serious. "Mr. Carter? My name is Olivia West. I'm an attorney. I represent Claire." My heart skipped a beat. "Claire? I thought I'd heard the last of her." "What does she want?" I asked coldly. A pause. Then Olivia said something that made my blood run cold. "She's filing for custody. The nightmare returns." I stood up so fast my chair nearly toppled over. "You're joking," I said, my voice sharp. "I'm afraid not," Olivia said. "Claire is claiming she was coerced into giving up custody. She says she wasn't in the right state of mind when she signed the agreement, and she wants to reestablish parental rights." I laughed bitterly. Oh, hell no. Claire had abandoned Ethan for over a year. She hadn't called, hadn't sent a card, hadn't even pretended to care. And now, she wanted to come back? "She won't win," I said. "She has no case." Another pause. She says she's changed, Olivia said carefully. She has a job now, a stable place to live, and she's engaged. I froze. Engaged? To who? Who's the guy? I demanded. Another long pause. Then Olivia sighed. Michael Bennett. History repeats itself for a moment. I couldn't breathe. Michael. Again. This wasn't just about Claire wanting to see Ethan. This was Michael's doing. That bastard had lost in court, lost his case, and lost his control over me. But now, he had. Found another way back into my life through Claire. I clenched my jaw. Not happening. Olivia exhaled. I figured you'd say that. Look, off the record? I don't think she has much of a case, but she's determined. And if this goes to court, it's going to be ugly. Let it get ugly, I said coldly. She's not getting near my son. Preparing for war. Again, I hung up and immediately called Mark. We have a problem, I said. By the time I finished explaining, Mark was already strategizing. Claire's move is weak, he said, but with Michael backing her, they might try to drag this out, paint you as an unfit parent, manipulate the court's sympathy. We need to go on offense. How? Mark hesitated. We dig. Claire and Michael are hiding something. They always are. And when we find it, we bury them. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking with rage. Michael had already tried to take Ethan once. Now he was using Claire to do it. But if he thought I was going to sit back and let it happen, he was dead wrong. The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. This time, I wasn't going to play defense. Michael and Claire thought they could walk back into my life, drag me through another custody battle, and manipulate the system to take Ethan from me. They had no idea what was coming for them. Gathering. The ammunition Mark wasted no time. Within hours, he had his team digging into Claire's and Michael's lives, and it didn't take long before we found the cracks. Claire's stable life was a lie. She had a job, sure, but it was barely paying her bills. She had an apartment, but she was 3 months behind on rent. And as for her engagement to Michael, that was where things got really interesting. Michael was a walking disaster. Fired from his last job due to fraud allegations. Multiple credit cards maxed out. A pending domestic disturbance report filed by his ex-girlfriend just before he got back with Claire. Mark smirked as he flipped through the reports. James, he said, tapping the paper, we just won. I exhaled. Not yet. I want this shut down permanently. No more threats. No more surprises. I want them out of our lives for good. Mark nodded. Then we go scorched earth. The setup, we needed to catch them in their own lies. So I made a move Claire and Michael weren't. Expecting, I called Claire. We need to talk, I said, keeping my voice neutral. She hesitated. About what? About making this easy, for Ethan's sake. She took the bait. I'm listening. I set up a meeting at a neutral location, a cafe with plenty of witnesses, and what Claire didn't know was that I had a recorder running the entire time. She showed up with Michael just as I expected. He smirked like he had already won. James, he said smugly. Glad you're being reasonable. I forced a polite smile. Let's cut to the chase. What do you want? Claire hesitated, but Michael jumped in. We want joint custody. I leaned back. Why now? Claire fumbled for words, but Michael, arrogant as ever, leaned in with a smug grin. Because we can, he said. You got lucky last time. But things are different now. Claire is Ethan's mother, and the court will listen to her. I tilted my head. Even after she abandoned him? Michael chuckled. Judges don't care about the past. They care about now, and right now Claire is stable. Married to me? Engaged, Claire corrected. Michael waved her off. Same thing. The court will see a loving mother trying to reconnect with her child and a bitter ex trying to keep her away. You'll lose, James. So why don't you just save yourself the legal fees? I stared at him, then at Claire. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at Michael, and I saw it. Hesitation. Doubt. But before she could say anything, Michael kept talking. Besides, he added, voice dripping with arrogance, do you really want the court digging into your life? I bet we could find something. That was all I needed. Michael had just threatened me on tape. Checkmate. The next day, Mark and I walked into the courtroom ready. Michael and Claire looked confident. That lasted about 5 minutes. Mark stood up and handed the judge a file. Your Honor, he said, before we address my client's response, I'd like to submit evidence regarding the petitioners. The judge glanced at the file. Proceed. Mark smiled, and then he tore them apart. Claire's financial instability. She is 3 months behind on rent. Hardly a stable environment for a child. Michael's criminal record. He has multiple fraud allegations, pending investigations, and... Mark paused for effect. A domestic disturbance report from just months ago. The judge's eyes flicked to Michael. Michael shifted uncomfortably. Then Mark delivered the killing. Blow! He pressed play on the recording. Michael's own voice echoed through the courtroom. You'll lose, James, so why don't you just save yourself the legal fees? The judge's expression hardened. Michael's face drained of color. Claire looked sick. Mark let the silence hang before speaking. Your Honor, this is not a case of a loving mother seeking custody. This is a manipulative ploy by Mr. Bennett to harass my client. And given the evidence, we are not only requesting that this case be dismissed with prejudice, meaning they can never file again, but we are also filing for a permanent restraining order against Mr. Bennett. Michael opened his mouth, but the judge raised a hand. I've heard enough, he said, voice sharp. Then he turned to Claire. Ms. Carter, I strongly advise you to re-evaluate your decisions. Your request for custody is denied. Permanently. Claire let out a choked gasp. Michael turned to her in disbelief. Claire, say something. But she didn't. She just stared at me. Realization sinking in. She had lost. Again, final goodbye. As we left the courtroom, I stopped beside Claire. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. You did this to yourself, I said quietly. You let him ruin you. Again. She didn't answer, and as I walked away, she didn't try to stop me. Michael, on the other hand, wasn't as silent. This isn't over, he shouted. I thought it was over. Michael was gone. Claire had lost. The court had shut them down permanently. For the first time in years, my life felt stable. But peace is a fragile thing, and sometimes the past refuses to stay buried. A mysterious letter started with a letter, not an email, not a text. A physical handwritten letter slipped under my front door. There was no return address, just my name. I hesitated before opening it, something about it sending a chill down my spine. Inside was a single sheet of paper and 4 words that made my blood run cold. You should have listened. My hands clenched around the paper. Michael. I knew it had to be him. But how? He had a restraining order. He wasn't allowed near me, near Ethan. I rushed to the window and scanned the street. Nothing. Just the normal, quiet suburban neighborhood, parents walking their kids, a man jogging past. No sign of Michael, but the weight of the letter pressed against my palm like a ghostly presence. I wasn't crazy. He was out there, watching. The return of the monster, I called Mark immediately. He's violating the restraining order, I said, pacing the room. Can we press charges? Mark exhaled. Not yet. There's no proof it's from him. I cursed under my breath. So what do we do? Wait until he does something worse. James, Mark said, voice low. Michael's dangerous, but he's also desperate. If he's sending you cryptic threats instead of taking legal action, it means he has no other moves left. He's grasping at straws. I wasn't convinced. Michael wasn't the type to give up. He was the type to destroy everything around him just to feel like he had control again. And I wasn't about to let him anywhere. Near my son, a sudden disappearance a week passed. No more letters, no calls, no sign of Michael. For a moment, I thought maybe Mark was right. Maybe Michael was all talk. Then, Claire disappeared. I found out when her sister Emily called me out of the blue. "James," she said, voice shaking. "Have you seen Claire?" I frowned. "No. Why would I?" "Because nobody has," Emily said. She stopped, answering calls. Her job says she hasn't shown up in days. Her landlord said she left in the middle of the night. It's like she just vanished. A cold dread settled in my chest. This wasn't a coincidence. This had Michael written all over it, a terrifying discovery. That night, I did something I swore I'd never do again. I went looking for Michael. I started with the only place that made sense, his old apartment. It was a rundown complex on the edge of town, the kind of place where people didn't ask questions. I paid the super $50 to let me into his unit. The place was a mess. Empty liquor bottles, unpaid bills stacked on the counter, and then, in the corner of the room, I saw something that made my breath hitch. A photo of Ethan, pinned to the wall, with a knife through it. My stomach turned. My hands shook. Michael wasn't just playing games, he was planning something. And Claire, she might already be his first victim. The hunt begins. I took a picture of the scene and sent it to Mark. "We need to find him, now." Within an hour, Mark had a private investigator on the case. The cops wouldn't do much without concrete evidence, but we weren't going to wait for them. I wasn't going to sit around and let Michael make his move. I was going to find him first, before he could do whatever the hell he was planning. Before he could hurt Claire, before he could come for Ethan. Because this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was war, and this time, I wasn't holding back. Michael had crossed the line. The photo of Ethan, the knife through it. This wasn't a warning. It was a declaration. He was coming. For me. For my son. And possibly for Claire. The question was why? Had she betrayed him? Had she tried to leave? Or was this all part of some twisted game he was playing? There was only one way to find out. A desperate Leadmark's private investigator, Ethan Cross, was one of the best in the business. By the next morning, he had something. Claire was last seen withdrawing cash from an ATM near the industrial district, he said over the phone. No credit card activity since. No phone calls, no trace of her after that. Industrial district, empty warehouses, no cameras. A perfect place to disappear. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. I was already on my way. I wasn't waiting anymore. The warehouse of nightmares, I arrived at the location Cross had given me. A decayed warehouse at the edge of town. Rusted metal doors. Broken windows. The kind of place you could scream for hours and no one would hear you. I parked a block away, took a deep breath. Checked my phone, one missed call from Mark. 2 texts. "James, be careful. Don't go in alone." Too late for that. I tucked my phone away and moved toward the building, my heart beat a steady drum in my ears. The front doors were chained shut. But around the back, I found a side entrance. The lock was broken. I pushed it open and stepped into the darkness. The truth revealed. The air inside was damp. Heavy. I moved cautiously, my footsteps barely making a sound. Then I heard it, a muffled voice. Weak. Pained. I followed the sound, weaving, through rusted machinery and stacks of old crates until I reached a door. It was slightly open. I pushed it the rest of the way and stopped cold. Claire. She was tied to a chair, her face swollen, her lips split. Her wrists were raw from struggling against the ropes. She lifted her head, eyes hazy, unfocused. "James," she whispered. Before I could move, a voice cut through the silence. "Well, well, well." I turned. Michael stepped out of the shadows. grinning, holding a gun. The final showdown. "Did you really think I was done with you?" Michael chuckled. "After everything? After you humiliated me in court?" I said nothing. My mind was racing, calculating, one gun, one man, a narrow space between us. If I lunged, could I reach him before he pulled the trigger? Michael smirked, as if reading my mind. "Go ahead," he taunted. "Try something, I dare you." I clenched my fists. "What do you want, Michael?" His smile faded. "I want my life back," he hissed. "I want to watch you suffer, the way I did." He gestured toward Claire with the gun, "And I want her to pay for what she did." Claire flinched. I frowned. "What she did?" Michael's grip on the gun tightened. "She betrayed me," he spat. "After everything I did for her, I gave her a second chance. I brought her into my life. And you know what she did?" Claire swallowed hard. "Michael, shut up," he snapped. She winced. Then I saw it, the way she refused to meet my eyes. She wasn't just afraid of him, she was guilty. "Claire," I said slowly, "what did you do?" Tears welled in her eyes. She hesitated. "I was going to take Ethan." My breath caught. Michael laughed darkly. "See?" he sneered. "She was never here for you, James. She was playing both sides. She planned to run. With your son. With my money." I stared at Claire. I wanted to hate her. But Michael was the real threat here. One problem at a time. The moment of truth. Michael turned the gun back to me. "You ruined my life," he whispered. "Now I'm going to return the favor." I saw it in his eyes. He was going to pull the trigger, now or never. I lunged. The gun went off. Pain exploded in my shoulder. I ignored it. I slammed into Michael, knocking the gun from his grip. We crashed to the floor, grappling, punching, clawing. Years of hatred unleashed in a brutal fight. But I had something he didn't. A reason to win. For Ethan. For my family. For myself. I slammed his head into the concrete. Once, twice, 3 times. Michael groaned. "Stop moving." Panting, I rolled off him and grabbed the gun. Claire was sobbing, still tied up. I pulled out my phone with a shaky hand. "Called Mark." "Call the cops," I gasped. "It's over." The end of Michael Bennett. The police arrived within minutes. Michael was unconscious when they took him away. Claire was taken to the hospital. And me? I went home. To Ethan. Where I belonged. The real victory. A week later, I stood in court again. This time, there was no fight. Michael was facing attempted murder charges. Claire had taken a plea deal. She wasn't getting custody. Not now. Not ever. And as I walked out of that courtroom, I knew this was truly over. No more battles, no more threats. Just me, my son, and a future finally free from the shadows of the past. As we walked to the car, Ethan grabbed my hand. "Dad?" "Yeah, buddy." "Are we really safe now?" I looked down at him, and for the first time in years, I could say with absolute certainty, "Yeah, kid, we are." The end. The Father's Day. Epilogue, The Last Secret, 6 months later. Michael was locked away. Claire was out of my life. Ethan and I were finally free. Or so I thought. Because on a cold autumn morning, I received one final letter. No return address. No signature. Just 5 words that made my blood freeze. "You don't know the truth." I stared at the paper, heart pounding. Not Michael. He was in prison. Not Claire. She had no reason to contact me. Then who and what truth? For the first time in months, I felt it again, that cold, creeping sensation, the feeling that something or someone was still out there, watching, waiting, and that my story wasn't over yet. I couldn't shake the letter. 5 words. It should have meant nothing. But there was something about them, something that gnawed at me, like a phantom memory just out of reach. You don't know the truth. I couldn't ignore it. The nagging sense, that there was something I was missing. A puzzle piece that had always been there but just hadn't clicked. I had to know what it meant. But who could have sent it? A ghost from the past. I called Mark. "I need you to dig deeper," I said, voice tight. "I don't care how, just find out who sent this." "You're sure it's important?" Mark asked, his tone skeptical. "I mean, it could just be some random—" "No," I cut him off. "I'm telling you, something's off. It feels like a warning." Mark sighed. "All right, I'll have my people look into it, but this might take time." I hung up and stared at the letter again. Suddenly a thought struck me. It wasn't about me. It wasn't about Michael. It was about Ethan, the unseen hand. The next day, I went through all the old records, papers, court documents, everything I could find about Ethan's past. Claire's lies, Michael's manipulation. It was all there. But then something new caught my eye. A name that hadn't appeared before. Madeline Bennett. I froze. Madeline Bennett. Michael's mother. I hadn't thought about her in years. But why was her name here? Why was she suddenly relevant? Madeline had always been a distant figure in Michael's life. A quiet woman who never interfered, always polite when we saw her, but barely involved. I had assumed she was just a passive bystander in Michael's chaos. But what if she wasn't? What if she had been the mastermind all along? A new leady called Mark again, urgency in my voice. "I need you to track down Michael's mother." Mark didn't ask questions. "I'll get on it. But don't do anything until I have more." I waited. It felt like the hours stretched on forever. By evening, Mark called. "I found her," he said, his voice lower than usual. "She's been living in a small town outside the city. No one's seen her in a while, but I've got an address." My heart raced. Madeline, the woman who might have known the real story behind everything. I didn't waste time. I packed up, grabbed my coat, and headed out. The final meeting. The town was small, too small to hide much. The streets were quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. I found her house tucked between two others, a quaint, faded home with ivy growing up the sides. I knocked on the door. It opened slowly. Madeline Bennett stood in the doorway, her face as serene and unreadable as I remembered. She looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "James Carter, what brings you to my doorstep?" I took a breath. "We need to talk. About Michael. About Ethan." Her expression didn't change. "You've been through enough, haven't you?" I stepped inside, my voice sharp. "I need to know the truth, Madeline, about your son, about what really happened." She closed the door behind me, locking it. Then she turned, walking into the small living room. "You think you understand everything, but you don't." I followed. "Then tell me. Tell me everything." The shocking truth. She sat down slowly, her hands folded in her lap. "You think Michael was always the problem? You think he was the one pulling the strings? No, James. Michael was a pawn in a game far bigger than either of us." My head spun. "What are you talking about?" Madeline leaned forward, her eyes glinting with a strange, knowing light. "I didn't raise Michael to be a monster, James. I raised him to survive." I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. "Survive?" She nodded. "Survive a family that would stop at nothing to destroy him. A family that created him for one purpose. To take over." "What do you mean?" Madeline's voice dropped to a whisper. "We're not just a normal family, James. The Bennetts have blood in their hands. I thought I could protect Michael. I tried, but I couldn't. The family's influence—" "It's deeper than you can imagine." I stared at her, disbelief flooding my mind. "My father," she continued, "was a part of something much darker, something dangerous. Michael, he was supposed to be the heir to everything. The power, the wealth, the control." I took a step back. What are you saying? That Michael's a part of some crime syndicate? Madeline's gaze hardened. Not just any syndicate. A legacy of control. You see, James, Michael wasn't just a troubled child. He was born into a bloodline that demanded power. And I was part of it. I married into it, thinking I could escape. But you can never escape your blood, James. The truth is, Michael wasn't the monster. I felt my throat tighten. Then who is? Madeline's eyes were cold now. It was always the family, and it still is. I stumbled backward, horrified by the revelations. The truth about Michael's mother and the depths of what he had been born into was a revelation I hadn't expected. My hands were shaking as I stared at the message from Mark. James, we just found something. Michael's not the only one. There's a bigger play at work here, a hidden network tied to your son, Ethan. I read it again. Ethan. My mind raced, panic and confusion threatening to overwhelm me. This couldn't be real. Could it? I looked up at the horizon, the weight of the world pressing down on me, a hidden network, something I had never even considered. Had I been blind this whole time? Had Michael been a pawn in a game I didn't even know existed? The hidden network. I rushed back to my car, barely registering the world around me as I dialed Mark. Talk to me, I barked, my voice strained. I've been digging, Mark's voice crackled. There's more to Michael than we thought. You know about his father, right? The one who vanished years ago? I swallowed hard. Yeah. What does that have to do with anything? Everything, Mark said grimly. I found out that Michael's father was connected to something huge. This network, this legacy Madeline mentioned, it's not just a family of criminals. It's a powerful organization, rooted deep in politics, business, and, believe it or not, international influence. I nearly slammed the brakes. Wait. International? Yes, the Bennetts are at the center of it. And your son, Ethan, he's the next heir. I couldn't breathe. No, that can't be possible. It gets worse, Mark continued, his voice now tinged with fear. I just found out they've been watching him. Watching you, James. They know who you are, where you live, and they've been grooming him for something big. I pulled over to the side of the road, my heart racing in my chest. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I whispered, a lump forming in my throat. I didn't know how deep this went until now. But James, you need to understand. This is bigger than you and me. This is about Ethan. A bloodline's burden. I sat there in silence, the weight of his words crushing me. Ethan, my little boy, the boy I had fought so hard to protect. And now he was at the center of a dark, twisted legacy that I had no idea existed until it was too late. I had always thought I was protecting him from Michael, but Michael had been nothing but a shadow in the storm. The real danger? It was the family. A bloodline that stretched across continents, manipulating and controlling people, networks, governments, and Ethan, my son. He was the key to it all. I didn't know what to do next. I had to get to Ethan. I had to protect him. But how could I do that if everything around us was part of a vast, hidden web of control? The unthinkable truth. I drove home as fast as I could, barely aware of the road, my mind consumed with thoughts of my son. I needed answers. When I walked into the house, Ethan was playing in the living room. His laughter filled the air, so pure and innocent. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I kneeled down next to him. Ethan, listen to me, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I need you to stay close to me. We're going to go somewhere safe, all right? He looked up at me, confused. What's going on, Dad? I hesitated, unsure of what to say. How do you explain something like this to a child? I'll explain later, I said. But for now, just trust me. It's important. He nodded, sensing the urgency in my voice. I stood up, my eyes scanning the room. Was someone watching us right now? Was this all just the beginning of something worse? Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I froze. Mark had warned me that this was going to escalate, but I wasn't ready for this. I slowly walked toward the door, my hand gripping the handle. When I opened it, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. A man stood there, tall, sharp features, dressed in a black suit. He was too well put together, too cold. His eyes locked on mine, calculating. James Carter? His voice was smooth, almost too calm. Who are you? I demanded. That's not important, the man said, stepping forward. I'm here because you've been chosen. Your son Ethan, he's part of a greater plan, a legacy. I took a step back, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. What do you want with him? The man smiled. A cold, calculating smile. Nothing you can stop? Before I could react, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. It wasn't just one car. It was several. I turned and looked through the window, and my blood ran cold. Cars with tinted windows, people dressed in dark suits, men who moved with precision like soldiers. The family had arrived. The final stand. I rushed to Ethan, grabbing his hand. We need to go, now! I grabbed my phone and called Mark. Mark, I need help. They're here. They know about Ethan. We're being watched. Where are you? Mark asked urgently. Home. But it's too late. There was a crash from the back door. Didn't have time to answer. I pulled Ethan with me as I ran through the house, my mind racing. They were here, and they weren't going to leave without him.